So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome, and it is warm. We have got the air conditioning on. I hope it's going to work. Very warm welcome to the second in our Conversations in Environmental Sustainability. And this series it will be running for the next 2 years, and each term we're addressing a question with a group of speakers around a really topical issue associated with environmental sustainability. Each conversation is led by a different academic in the college. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Dimitrios Tsomocos. So Dimitri is a professorial fellow and is at the Side Business School, but we're also extremely fortunate to have him here as a fellow and a governing body fellow at St Edmund Hall. So Dimitri, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome. We should have put in our note that we have air conditioning in this day. That would have been something very useful. I want to welcome you from the Oxford community, to thank everybody who contributed in our development office, and Andrew and many people, and Christina, who co-hosts and helped me tremendously to put together and implement the second conversation. That was an idea of our principal last year, and as always, he implemented it very quickly, fastly, and efficiently. Let's hope that we will not go under the bar in the second one. Today, what we're going to try to flesh out in this panel is about measurement. How do we measure? When we talk about environmental stability, and how do we define what is green and what is not green? What is the question of the scale of the audit? What is the suitable data sources and metrics that are currently available? How many metrics should we be using? In fact, being an economist, this brings me back when I started working on financial regulation at the Bank of England, and I was summoned in a very important office to have my bag of tricks, my models, to talk about financial stability. So I went to the office. I was just a fresh PhD from the US, and there were 4 very senior people and myself. You realize I was kind of a little bit reticent and scared, and I asked the following question after they told me what they wanted me to do. I said, what is the definition of financial stability? That was back, I will tell you that the time, I will reveal my age, but it's okay, it's 2000. And I said, what's financial stability? How do we define it? There were 4 people plus me 5, and we had 6 definitions. So it reminds me the same kind. We're back in the future with this question, and we have invited here 3 distinguished people from the Oxford community, which is Dr. Nicola Ranger, who is a leader and a development executive director of the Oxford Martin Systemic Resilience Program, and she traditionally helps financial institutions, public and private, to factor climate and environmental risks. Prior, she works extensively in emerging and developing economies, particularly in Asia and Africa, and prior to joining Oxford, she has worked extensively in the World Bank and has made very important contributions to various central banks and regional institutions to strengthen financial resilience, climate, and other crises. So Nicola Ranger is our first speaker. The second one is somebody in the Oxford community, in the Teddy Hall community we know quite well, Jonathan Taylor, who's the president of the Awesix services, and after having worked 11 years at Cargill, leading the soya and protein crops business for EMEA. Now he advises clients on all respects of commodity trading and international supply chains. And he's one of the most potent advocates for making supply chains more environmentally friendly and sustainable. Last but not least, safe pair of hands from Oxford, we hope so, is Harriet Waters, who is the head of the environmental sustainability of the University of Oxford, and his primary remit is to be responsible for the long-term planning and the direction of environmental sustainability at Oxford University. including reduction of carbon emissions from the university estate. She oversees the delivery of a wide range of strategies and services implemented by the environmental sustainability team. Without many more information, I'll give the floor to our three speakers that will speak around 15 minutes. Then we'll start opening the conversation to the floor, and then all of them, they will start engaging with each other and with ourselves to illuminate how do we measure environmental sustainability and green. So Nicola will be the first speaker. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. So I have some bad news for you, I'm afraid. So I currently work for the Bank of England, and I'm working on helping them understand the impacts of nature on financial stability in the UK. And actually, in my last meeting with them, I said, well, can you define financial stability so that I know what to measure? And they couldn't give me a definition. So 23 years later, the problem still isn't solved. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So, as was introduced, my name's Nicola Ranger. I'm based at the Environmental Change Institute, which is part of the School of Geography and Environment. I run the program there on adaptation and international development, so I work particularly in developing economies, but also in the UK with the Bank of England and others. And I direct a program called the Oxford Martin Systemic Resilience Program, which is all about how to build systemic financial system, environmental system, social systems, and the interaction between them, and particularly sort of responds to the recent crises like COVID and the Ukraine crisis, etc. So today I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing with financial institutions. So a lot of my work, and this is both in my team, in the Environmental Change Institute, but also in the Smith School. So we work extensively with financial institutions. So be it central banks, ministries of finance, investors, asset owners, etc., ratings agencies, asset managers, and all around this issue of how do we bring climate and environmental sustainability issues into day-to-day decision-making, and how do we help them to design financial products that help to bring more finance into activities that support sustainability. And a lot of us are proper geeks, I should say. So a lot of what we do is around data and analytics. So this whole question of the measurement of that. So I myself am a scientist originally, but have worked in sort of economics and finance for most of my professional career. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to what I see as some of the issues, some of the challenges in measurement, some of the things that I see as priorities for action. And then I'm going to sort of talk about two particular areas of my work. So I'm going to look at the sort of beyond carbon. So I will talk about carbon, but my own work is really around the sort of water, food, biodiversity, circular economy issues, and then talk about two specific initiatives that I'm involved in. So just as a bit of context, I know we have some financial professionals here, but for those of you that aren't financial professionals, why is this important? So the global financial system has a huge impact on the shape of our economy. So where financial institutions choose to invest or lend can really guide the development of the global economy. So when they're investing more in fossil fuels than renewables, for example, that creates that embeds that structure of fossil fuels and those sort of damaging activities more into our economy. Financing value chains that at the end of the value chain lead to deforestation, so let's say sort of intensive meat production in parts of the world, for example, then that impact on deforestation is being sort of embedded in the financial system or through the financial system. But similarly, a number of the solutions to these sustainability challenges need to come from the finance that the financial system is providing. So, how financial institutions choose to invest, how they assess risks, how they assess impacts, and the regulatory frameworks around that have a really big impact on our environment, our economy, our society for decades to come. And And the discussion on this has been, really going on for around sort of 20 years or more. But a real sort of milestone was around in 2015. And this is a picture of Mark Carney giving his famous speech at Lloyd's of London, where he laid out this speech. It's called the Tragedy of the Horizon speech, where he identified this challenge that financial institutions are making decisions that aren't taking into account the long term, because they're often making decisions over, say, or even seconds up to a couple of years at most. And that doesn't then take into account these longer term implications of the decisions that are being made. So central banks started to realize that actually this is a financial stability risk, because financial institutions are investing in assets that could be creating damage down the line that would have severe impacts on our economy and society. But because those are not being assessed, because they're thinking shorter term, as financial institutions do, then it's sort of locking in this potential risk. So Mark Carney made a number of important statements. He's saying the more we invest with foresight, the less we'll regret with hindsight, and really sort of saying that financial institutions need to start assessing risk over a slightly longer timescale. So where does greenwashing come into this then? So a huge number of really positive things have happened in the financial sector over the last 10 years or so, and particularly in the last couple of years. So we're seeing more funding going into renewable energy, for example. We can really see that based on the evidence. We're seeing more disclosures happening. So all of the G7 economies, most of the G20 economies require financial institutions to disclose their emissions, for example, the risks that they're creating, and to make that information available so that then investors can decide, is this something we want to invest in or not? Putting in place taxonomies that show, is this activity green or not green? Labeling requirements on financial products. So if you're a consumer buying a financial product, you can see what is the impact of that financial product. Now, the greenwashing discussions come out of this in some of those financial instruments and tools that are being used. Are they actually having the impact that is being claimed? That's really what greenwashing is. So, a lot of financial institutions are saying, we're getting to net zero. We're green, we're pulling out of fossil fuel investments, but are they really? So that's really what greenwashing is about. And this has become a very high profile issue. Just a few examples. Recently, back in January, there was a big study actually led by Cambridge looking into carbon offsets, and found that 90% of these offsets are potentially worthless. And a lot of institutions are using those to offset their carbon emissions. So actually that's not the financial institution's fault necessarily, but the whole market. And the issue for the financial institutions is, are they really assessing these products properly? You've seen, for example, last year, the DWF, the chief had to resign based on greenwashing claims. There was a financial conduct investigation there. This was actually just published work by the Smith School a couple of weeks ago, looking at net zero targets. So we do a lot of analysis of when a corporate or financial institutions makes a net zero target. Have they actually got the things in place to deliver that? Is it a really credible target? They showed that fewer than half of US companies even have a net zero target. Recently, there's been some discussion around the sustainability bond market. So the sustainability-linked bonds were really seen as a really good way that we could bring more financing into sustainability, but they've been criticised. And then we have sort of high-profile examples here. Example of HSBC that got in trouble for financing a German coal mine. That's one of many. So these are the types of issues. So how do we resolve this? So one of the key challenges that we have is around data. So the way that a lot of financial institutions decide, is this investment sustainable or not sustainable, is through using data. So they need to have data on the individual companies' assets that they're investing in. But there are huge challenges around the ability to assess the sustainability of a particular company, and huge divergences in the various data sets that are available. So there are some big private sector providers of these types of data, MCI, Bloomberg, Sustainalytics, etc., that a lot of all the financial institutions will use. And if you compare them, so this sort of compares for different companies, what is their sustainability score between different providers. So this will show the different scores. And you can see there's actually a vast differences in the scores. So one of the key issues is around data. So we find it really difficult as a society to really measure the sustainability impact of a company. So what are some of the solutions then? Greater transparency is really important, more disclosure, but also having more verification around that, improved reporting, clearer regulatory standards, new types of products that would be less exposed to greenwashing, more evidence of impact, and sort of verifiable and objective data. I think there are some risks in this area that I want to identify. So greenwashing has become a big discussion point and a big focus of regulators. But to some extent, I think that we are in a process of learning at the moment. We are making a big shift in the financial sector, and a lot of financial institutions that I talk to are very worried really worried, about being sued, etc., because of greenwashing claims. And that makes them even more nervous to try sustainability-linked products, for example. So I think it's really, really important that we make swift progress in this area in providing better data, for example, providing clearer standards so that we don't get delays in what could happen. So you see, recently there's been pushback against the FCA's sustainability disclosures and all of the data requirements that are involved in that. So these are some of the challenges. So we're at a really difficult point at the moment between, this is really important, and we need to make sure that what we're doing in terms of finance is really robust, but also not kind of scare the horses so much that nothing happens. So some of the things then, coming onto the data then, so some of the things that we're doing. So this is actually work by my colleagues in the Smith School, in the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group, who do a lot of work around data, particularly on the carbon emissions side. And a lot of their work is around objective sources of data. So a lot of the data that I showed earlier is companies' own reporting. But actually, if you can have completely independent data, that can be really important. So my colleagues in the Smith School do a lot of work, for example, using satellite data to actually look at individual assets. So an individual mine or an individual a gas turbine, and actually are able then to measure through satellites things like their emissions. So they can provide that information openly available, and that really helps financial institutions to understand the impact that they're having, but also for others, third parties, to be able to hold them account for that as well. We also do a lot of work around transition plans. So these are really important. So companies not just disclosing, saying, I'm going to have a net zero target, but then helping them to think about, okay, how do you have a plan to get there that is actually credible? And we work very closely with the FCA on that as well. Now, coming into some of my own work just briefly, so a lot of my work is more on the side of natural environment, food, water, biodiversity, etc. So one of the questions that was set out for this event is, well, should we just focus on carbon or should we focus more broadly? I would definitely argue we need to focus more broadly. And there's an argument against that, which is that actually this is really hard anyway. We're really struggling with the data. This is really hard for a lot of financial institutions to be able to measure carbon emissions of every investment, for example. Do we want to push them to do even more? But I think the urgency, sorry, losing my voice, the urgency suggests that we definitely do. But there are a lot more challenges when it comes to measuring impact in these areas. So this, for example, is the same group that I just showed before that have done a sort of mapping of assets against threatened species. Obviously, it's really hard because you can say, okay, this asset, which is in Borneo, is in an area of biodiversity richness, but actually is it having an impact? You can't tell that from a satellite. Well, there are ways that they're starting to try and do it, but it's much, much more difficult to say this, and you also need to understand whole supply chains So a lot of this is much more indirect. So you need to know, okay, my company is investing in this one, and that's investing in this one, and that one has this subsidiary. So you have to measure along a whole supply chain. So it's much, much more complicated. And we can do things like understand the dependency of a particular sector on different types of ecosystems and the potential impact, but actually measuring that is so much more difficult. But it is incredibly important. So this is some analysis that my team has done looking at FTSE 350 companies and looking at what sectors they're operating in. And we can see just from the types of sectors and countries that they're operating in that upwards of 60% of them are operating in areas that we know will be having a really big impact on water systems, on food systems, on biodiversity. So we really need to very quickly get better at estimating these impacts. There's also a question about scope 3. So for those of you that are not in this space, your scope 1 impact is sort of the impact that you're having on your premises. Your scope 2 is then through the electricity that you're using, for example. And then the scope 3 is your full value chain, your full supply chain. So the question that we were set out is, do you need to understand your scope 3? Well, actually, for these types of impacts, you really do, because you're missing a huge amount if you're not looking at your scope 3 emissions. So we've been looking at how we develop a framework, sort of similarly to the emission side, but that also works for nature. So how you can start measuring your scope 3, as we call it, impact on nature, throughout your whole value chain. We've done a lot of work looking at the existing indicators, and what we've found is the types of metrics that financial institutions are using, a lot of them could be quite easily adapted to looking at these types of impacts. And what we're doing now is saying, based on these metrics that financial institutions already use, can we come up with really independent, verifiable metrics that could be measured by satellite or by AI, for example, to enable them to do the analysis that they need to do. And one of the big initiatives that I run is something called the Global Resilience Index Initiative. And here we just pile together all of the open data that's available, and we work together with financial institutions to help them use that to measure both risk to them and also their impact. We're doing a lot of work with infrastructure investors, for example. So this shows a tool that we've built for East Africa. This is actually my colleague Jim Hall's work. So a tool that we've built for Africa where you can actually zoom into a particular infrastructure asset and get information on, okay, what impact is that infrastructure having in terms of, or what risk is it exposed to for flood, but then what impact is it having potentially on local communities as well. And then finally, some work looking at broader sort of biodiversity indices, working in Costa Rica actually with the financial regulator, helping them to look at how they can use data to look at the nature-related impacts of their financial sector. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As it quite clearly says, my name is Jonathan Taylor, and I am president of a company called Awesix in Switzerland. So, we were asked to address 3 questions, all linked to measurement. Instead of addressing those questions, I'm going to address 3 other questions. What are we trying to achieve? Which individuals can influence that? And how can we incentivize them to do so? Now, I may sound like a very adept politician. I can assure you I'm not in politics. As I say, I work for a company called Awesix, and essentially we work with a broad range of clients, but all of those clients, one way or another, are connected to or impacted by commodity supply chains. Increasingly, we're spending more and more time addressing environmental issues for those clients. Whether that's that they've got solutions that they want to implement and need to interact with supply chains in order to do that, whether that's that they're at the end of the supply chain and they need to understand their supply chains to better understand their environmental footprint, or whether they're involved in regulatory affairs or they're in policy. We also have a flagship project called Sensibilis, which is It's essentially about bringing a practical solution to the problem of linking goods to verification systems along complex supply chains. So the reason I mention that here is the name sensibilis. So sensibilis is the Latin word from which we in England derive sensible. It's also the root of the French word sensible, which means sensitive. And that epitomizes everything that we're trying to do at Awesix, as well as just within sensibilis, that it's about being sensitive to nature and the environment, but being sensible in how we go about it. Before Awesix, I worked at Cargill, where I was a soya trader, and then I led the soya business and protein crop business in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. What that means is that if you've consumed meat, dairy, or eggs in the last 10 years, then I've fed you. I don't say that just to sound arrogant. What I'm getting at here is that we've all been part of the same supply chain. And what that means is that if you want to be able to measure that supply chain, if you want to be able to understand the measurement of the impact that you've had on the environment, you would have needed information from me in order to be able to do that. And that's information I almost certainly would not have given you. So it's not just about, and Nicola talked very well about actually doing the measurements, but how does that measurement then work along a supply chain? And before all of this, I studied engineering here at the Hall. So, if I'm not a politician, why have I chosen to answer 3 completely different questions to the ones that were posed? That's quite simple. I often see a lot of clients who jump into conclusions. They jump into, we want to do this, we want to do that. Actually, we can't answer any of these questions unless we first answer these ones. And furthermore, I think, assuming there's a reasonable level of intelligence in the room, which I'm sure there is, if we answer these ones, if we address the questions on the left-hand side, to a large extent, the questions on the right-hand side will address themselves. So, what are we trying to achieve? I say this is the first question I ask any client I work with. You might think it's obvious, but the reality is that there are a lot of different motives at play here. The answer I usually get is some sort of nonsense along the lines of we want to be more environmentally friendly, or we want to reduce our carbon footprint. I can tell you very few people, if anybody, want to be environmentally friendly for the sake of being environmentally friendly, and equally very few people want to reduce their carbon footprint for the sake of reducing their carbon footprint. And so what happens when they give me one of those answers is I start incessantly asking why. Rather like a petulant child. In fact, I saw my 5-year-old goddaughter yesterday, and she did something very similar to me. And that's because I want to get to the bottom of what it is they're really trying to achieve. So, just to make this point, if I could have a volunteer, please. Anybody? There we go. Thank you very much. What's your name?
Sophie.
Sophie, nice to meet you, Sophie. Sophie, I'd like you to play me, sensitively, I hope, and sympathetically. All I want you to do is ask me what it is I'm trying to achieve, and then every time I answer, just ask me why. Okay?
Okay.
Over to you.
So what are you trying to achieve?
I want to remove goods from areas of deforestation risk from my supply chain.
Why?
To reduce deforestation risk caused by my business.
Why?
To play my part in reducing deforestation globally.
Why?
Because forests are important carbon sinks and we need them to remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Why?
Because CO2 is causing global warming, and that's very bad.
Why?
Because rising temperatures are bad.
Why?
Because it will cause poverty and hunger. Now, I think that's probably as far as we need to go on that. We could go on forever. But often what I see when I ask these questions, what I hear back, is that when you get to the end of what people are really trying to achieve, it's contrary to what they initially said they wanted to do. And I mean, I'm sure you can all pick holes in the arguments that I just made there, and that's not unusual. That is symptomatic of what happens in those kind of conversations. And that's because people don't think. In today's world, we all like to jump into getting information, absorbing information, sharing information, and we don't often enough take the time to step back and think. And so I ask you all to go away and do that process for yourselves. Ask yourselves why incessantly until you get to a point of something which you think, actually, that's just something I hold to be true. Whatever that thing is, ultimately will be a choice, and it will be different for different people in the room. Personally, I have a choice that involves a thing I call cellular happiness. We don't have time to go into that now, but broadly speaking, think of happiness, and for me, native vegetation, biodiversity, nature, they're all a key part of happiness, and therefore, like Nicola, yes, from my perspective, it has to be more than CO2 and GHG emissions. But that doesn't have to be the case for everybody. You have to answer that question for yourself as to what is your core motive, what is the thing that you're really trying to achieve. So, having addressed what it is that you want to achieve, the next question you need to ask yourself is which individuals can influence that? And notice that I asked you what your personal motives were. Very often in the discussion around environmental sustainability, we get stuck talking about what do governments want to do, what do corporates want to do, what should governments do, what should corporates want to do, what should NGOs do. Companies, governments, and NGOs have objectives, but they do not make decisions. Individuals make decisions. And so when it comes to influence, the question has to be, who are the individuals that I want to influence? And there are probably many people who you will need to influence, whatever the objective is that you choose. Often, or one of the most common ones, is suppliers and supply chains. And so I'm going to focus on that, but please don't take it as that's the entire scope of potential need for influence. And in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on soya, which is a supply chain that I know very well. Earlier I said that I've fed most of you in the room, and this is how. So here what we can see, this is a very, very simplified map of a supply chain going from soybeans being grown on a farm through various elevators, crushed to produce soy meal, either at the origin or here in the destination, then going into feed, which is then fed to a chicken, which then goes to a distribution center and eventually ends up on your plate. Okay, so that is a very simplified supply chain of how a soybean grown somewhere, let's say in Brazil, ends up in a chicken that you're eating. Now, when we look at this supply chain, we need to think about an influence. We need to think both about direct and indirect influence. And Nicola touched on this earlier. You have a choice. If you're down here, do you want to influence the farmer directly, or do you want your influence to be passed back through the supply chain? Now, if you want to go for that latter option of passing your influence back through the supply chain, you need every single step in the way to do that for you. So you need to influence every single step in the way. It's not just about influencing the farmer, you need to influence all the different steps. Even if you go direct to the farmer, if you then want to link that to what you're doing, you need the data to flow this way through the supply chain. And again, at every single step, you need that data to be passed along. And bear in mind, this is a very simplified version of the supply chain. That, I think, explains and touches on what Nicola was saying about the fact that it's not just about measuring, but it's about how do we then link that. And this is the role, this is what I want to talk about a little bit more now. So, this blue part here on the right-hand side, it's fairly easy in this part of the market. Why is it easy there? Two reasons. Firstly, I think this is fairly easy for people to understand. They're fairly typical businesses. The business model here is you produce a product, you market it because it's better quality, you add value, you grow your revenue by adding value to products. Normally, the corporate objective is fairly closely aligned to what actually happens in reality. And a big difference is that from this point on, you're talking about discrete goods. So it's, if you like, a packaged good or a single discrete item. And that means that it can be labeled. It can be tagged with a certain amount of information. So if you've measured it, once you get to this point, passing it along is very easy. This part of the supply chain is where most people struggle. And they struggle with that for two reasons. One, that very few people understand it. Very few people understand how the people who are operating here actually think. And secondly, it's a lot harder to tag information to goods that are going through that part of the supply chain. And to explain what I mean by that, I'll use the analogy of a car. So if I were to ask you for details about your car, you could all tell me what the make, model of your car is, probably the year that it was produced. And if I really pushed you, you could probably find me a chassis number which will tell you all of the details I could ever possibly want to know about your car. Now think about the petrol that's in your car. You can probably tell me where you filled up last week, but I'm willing to bet that you didn't drain the tank before you did it, which means that if I ask you where does the fuel come from that you're using right now, you can't tell me whether it's the fill-up you did yesterday, the one from last week, or even the week before, or even before that. And so it becomes very difficult because you can't tag each molecule of petrol, and so you can't tell me with the origin and the information that is attached to that. Now translate that to here. Every single one of these little sort of circle symbols is a point in the supply chain where that happens. So if you can't tell me where your petrol came from, imagine how hard it is to go through even this very simplified supply chain and work out where the goods came from and any measurement data that goes with that. Now, having said that it's difficult, it's not impossible. And there are various ways in which measurement is attached to goods through bulk commodity supply chains. Unfortunately, a lot of those end up going into measurement for the sake of measurement. A good example of that is palm oil coming into Europe. So there was a big initiative a few years ago about reducing deforestation risk of palm oil. That was the overall objective. The way that they then went about that was to say, well, we need to know where all the palm oil comes from. So we need to know the plantation where the palm was grown that is attached, that ended up coming in on that vessel coming into Europe. Obviously, the intention from that is then to drive change. What happened in reality is now every vessel of palm oil that comes into Europe has a big long list of, if it came from Indonesia, it lists every single plantation in Indonesia. If it came from Malaysia, it lists every single plantation in Malaysia. So there you go. That's what you asked for. You asked for measurement. You asked for traceability data. You've got traceability data. You haven't actually achieved what you set out to do. So I urge against that. Now, how do we influence these people in the middle? First of all, who are they? And within the commodity trading group, when it comes to environmental sustainability, there are three, in most companies, and again simplified, there's three main groups. You've got the corporate group, the sustainability group, and the traders. The headlines you see in the media about corporate policy, etc., that all obviously comes from corporate. Sustainability people, they're all very well intentioned. They're long-term advocates of environmental sustainability, but have very little influence within the company. The traders and the commercial lot, they're the people who actually make decisions on a day-to-day basis. So many people come in with ideas and they try to influence this area. If you want to be successful, you need to influence this area. And how do you do that? Well, the good news is that actually increasing the people in that area care about sustainability and care about the environment. They're humans like the rest of us. The problem is that they're all geared to winning. They're all desperate to win. And they can't quite work out how is it that I can do what I want from an environmental perspective and still keep winning. So the key to dealing with them is actually addressing their fears. So making sure they're going to see adequate return on investment if you're asking them to invest, but equally, making sure that financially it makes sense for them. Logistical disruptions, that is the nightmare of any commodity business. Loss of trading liquidity. They need to trade because that's how they make money. It's also how they reduce risk. sharing data. They are pathological haters of sharing data. And so when we start to talk about metrics, that's why, as I said, if you'd have asked me in the last 10, 15 years for the information you needed to be able to measure the impact of your chicken, I wouldn't have told you. Not because there's a particular reason why I shouldn't, just because it is so ingrained in the minds of these people not to share data. And so if you can overcome these, what you'll find is that actually they're quite receptive. But instead of starting by the pitch of this is what I want you to do, first we have to solve these concerns for them. So I'll quickly wrap up. Don't jump in at the deep end. Take a step back. Think about what it is you're actually trying to achieve. Then when it comes to measurement, think about why you're measuring. The only purpose of measuring is a means to an end. Make sure that you focus on what that end is and make sure that the measurement policies you put in place are appropriate to that end. And then which individuals can influence that? Focus on individuals, not companies, not governments, not NGOs. And how do you incentivize them to do that? Address their fears, make it easier for them. So conscious of time, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I think you'll find it really interesting how many different touch points there are between our three talks this evening. That's been really fascinating, Nicola and Jonathan. Thank you very much. So my name's Harriet Waters. I'm one of those very uninfluential people because I'm in the sustainability team at the university. And I've worked here now for 10 years. Prior to that, I did a very similar job at Oxford University. But before that, I used to assess companies for their environmental performance. So one of Nicola's slides is the kind of work that I used to do. And it was really at the beginning of looking at ethical performance for organisations. And it was the company that I worked for that came up with all of the criteria for an index called FTSE for Good. And of course, we're in a very different world now, but it's really interesting to see how much has changed, but still how important and how difficult this kind of issue is. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And completely opposite to Jonathan, I've decided to take each question in turn and answer them. So I think we pair very well. But this was a difficult question in a way, because it feels like a trick question. Like, obviously the answer is no, they shouldn't just focus on their CO2 emissions. But, you know, this is me, a non-influential sustainability person, and I'm sure people listening to people working in my sector get a bit fed up of us asking for things, and as soon as those things are done, we ask for something else. And then when we're asked when we'll stop, we don't have an answer, because there's always going to be something else that we're going to be asking for. But I think from a university perspective, it's always been the case that although carbon is a really big issue and a really big focus, we ought to be thinking about other things as well. And I should say a bit more about my remit at the university. I work for the Central University, so I don't have any mandate for the colleges. The colleges are all independent, separate bodies. I do have a mandate across our departments, but our departments and divisions have a very high amount of their own power, for want of a better word. We're very, very devolved. It's not the type of organisation where you write a policy and that policy is implemented overnight. It's a kind of organisation where you might put a lot of work into a strategy and then a lot of work into implementing it, and that's exactly what I've been doing. So just to back up this question about whether or not we ought to be focusing on more than just carbon, I thought it was useful to bring up this lovely diagram from Kate Raworth about planetary boundaries, and hopefully it's something that you'll be familiar with and seen before. This donut economics approach, where lots of areas of impact, environmental impacts, we are already outliving those boundaries in our planet. And this is just one of lots of different examples of research that goes on in university worlds where we're kind of trying to sound the horn that there ought to be more being done on environmental issues. And that's great, but potentially not very influential. It's when somebody like the World Economic Forum comes up with the biggest risks to the globe and biodiversity loss and climate change being right up in that top right-hand quadrant where people really start sitting up and taking notice. And that was why the university came to its decision in 2019 to come up with its first environmental sustainability strategy. That sounds like we did nothing before that. It's not the case. I didn't work here for 8 years before then and just twiddle my thumbs. We had strategies that were very much subject-based. So when I arrived, we already had a carbon reduction strategy. We'd had a waste strategy, a transport strategy, you can imagine is key for Oxford. But there was nothing that was really an umbrella approach for the university, and we kept on struggling with big questions that looked like we weren't addressing the real issues for the institution. So it was announced in 2019 that we would come up with a more comprehensive and ambitious strategy. Just noticed that awful typesetting, sorry. We got on with it from then on. So the Vice-Chancellor announced our intention at her oration, which is a speech that she makes every year, and then went on to hold a roundtable to which we invited academics and students and senior staff to really try to understand that question of what are you trying to achieve? The roundtable was just the start of that, but we then had monthly meetings and did 2 consultations with all staff and students across the university, really working out what the position of the university might be, what our ambition might be, and what kinds of things were reasonable for us to try and aspire to. It was all planned beautifully, and we had lots of engagement events planned for March of 2020, where we're going to meet people, talk to them, find out exactly what they wanted us to do. But of course, we were all sent to work from home. So we carried on, did digital consultation. People were really excited that the university was taking a stronger and more ambitious, more comprehensive stance. But they weren't very happy at the speed that we had set ourselves. So you'll know that the UK has set itself a net zero target by 2050. And at this point, that was all we committed to. And the voices back from the university community were very loud to say that that was ridiculous, that Oxford would try to achieve that by 2050 and we should try a lot harder. So that's what we spent our summer of 2020 doing. And we did financial modelling based on lots of carbon reduction type projects that we'd done before, and bringing in things like the fact that the UK grid is planned to be net zero by 2035, looking at what funding might be available. And that's how we came up with our year. So we didn't just pluck a year out of the air, take 5 years off Cambridge's target, add a few years to UCL's target. We did do some background to it. And then we also worked out that this being Oxford, having our 2 main headline goals was great, but it needed a very clear route to implementation as well. And that's where we spent time thinking about our enablers, a little bit about who can influence us getting to where we wanted to get to. And the first of those was our governance enabler. And in an institution like Oxford, governance is our lifeblood. So, we work on our committees, and the committee that we already had in place for sustainability was just not fit for purpose. It was reporting to our building committee, which had seemed sensible at the time, but you could ask the building committee what we should be doing about providing meat, and it seemed like a very odd question, or what we should be doing about our investments, what we should be doing about the university's flight impact. There were lots of opinions, but that committee did not have the remit to answer those kinds of questions. So we've now set up a higher level of sustainability governance, which reports straight into our committee that decides about allocation of funding. And it's a committee that's extremely busy. Kathy's been a very valuable member of that committee. We meet twice a term at the moment. They've done some really interesting things. So the first meeting that we had, we took a proposal to install a heat network up at our campus in Headington, the Old Road campus. And that was turned down because the heat network was going to be run on a gas-fired CHP, and the committee felt that having made this commitment to reducing our carbon, we ought not to be bringing in new bits of gas consumption. So that kind of took us back quite a long way, but they've also really guided us through decisions such as bringing in a levy on flights made on behalf of the university. We've changed a lot of policy in the time that we've been around. Our second enabler is reporting, and within the strategy we commit to report on our carbon and our biodiversity impacts, so in line with our two big targets. Carbon, I'll talk about a bit more. It's fairly straightforward in some ways for our kind of direct emissions of carbon, and it's something that we've been doing for a long time. But we've been doing it to quite a small audience. So we've been developing our own sustainability report, plus actually all universities report their carbon emissions through a wonderful website called the Higher Education Statistics Authority. So if that's your thing, you can go and look at any carbon emissions from any UK university for years back. But it wasn't really getting an audience, and it didn't really underline the importance of this kind of information. So we now have carbon and biodiversity data within our financial statement. And the biodiversity data has been really difficult to get to and will need a lot more work. We also needed funding, so we came up with the Oxford Sustainability Fund, which has 3 income streams. We proposed for, one of them hasn't worked. Those income streams were kind of existing income that we were already being given by the university, but also government funding through our renewables installations. The second was this levy that I mentioned. So we now place a carbon levy on every single flight made on behalf of the university. And that money is brought back into the university's sustainability fund to reduce our carbon emissions. And then the one that failed was one about bringing back savings from carbon reduction projects that we did across the estate. And then the other one that we use was ring fencing some of our student fees. So we've got a healthy budget. We're planning to spend about £200 million across the programme. And we've got a budget for next year of about £8 million, a lot of which will be spent on energy efficiency projects. And then offsetting is there for completeness. It's not something that we're engaging in right at this moment. So we have concluded that it's highly likely to get to net zero that we will need to offset, but that we won't really start doing that until much nearer the time, because we don't want to take our eye off the reduction of our carbon emissions from our estate. And then we have these 10 priorities that really help us guide our activity, which are what you'd expect to see in any environmental sustainability strategy, but of course it's got research and curriculum because of who we are. And those are areas where we've had lots of exciting developments since the strategy was adopted. So what's the appropriate scale? Again, it feels like a trick question. Should we just be doing our direct impact? Should we just be doing our carbon emissions from our estate? Should we just be doing, when we think about biodiversity and achieving biodiversity net gain, which if there are biodiversity experts in the room, by that we don't mean we are going to apply the new legislation which requires us to achieve biodiversity net gain. What we're trying to achieve is a nature positive university, I think would be how we describe it now. But when you first think about biodiversity in the university, you're immediately taken to those kind of green jewels of our estate, so Whiteham Woods, the Arboretum, the Botanic Garden. And that's really not where the biggest impact lies. So these are fantastic places, and I would always argue for there being more green space in Oxford and concentrating on that to a certain extent. But in doing the analysis on what our biodiversity footprint really was, it was really the results were really quite shocking in terms of what the difference is between the biodiversity impact that we have directly and indirectly. So again, just as Jonathan and Nicola have said, that biodiversity impact from the supply chain is absolutely huge, and how we start to tackle that is something that we're still wrestling with. And a bit the same with carbon. So we're really confident and very literate with our carbon data for gas consumption and electricity consumption. We've got that stuff just about sorted. But look at it in comparison to those orange bars, which are Scope 3 emissions. And obviously this is old data, but I thought it was more sensible to use pre-pandemic data before everything went a bit strange. And we've also got flights, which would be a Scope 3, an indirect impact on that side of the red line, because we've got more information about that data. So we're quite confident of everything on the left-hand side of the red line. We're not confident of the data on the right-hand side of the line. And the only, the most common methodology that's used at the moment is splitting all of our supply chain into different areas and then using a proxy for carbon that is linked to spend. Now, obviously, that's a bit of a nonsense, because if you spend more on something that's more sustainable, that equates to more carbon emissions. So it's an area that we will have to get better at, but the whole world will have to get better at. And of the hundreds of thousands of suppliers that we have, there are a couple that can give us exact carbon data about our supplies. And that's fantastic, but that really needs to grow like a rush. And of those couple, this kind of method that we're using at the moment is giving us larger data. It's been a conservative use of the factor, but I've heard about other carbon emissions that have been identified where the spend data is just a very, very small indication of what the carbon impact is. I hope that explains that. So we're thinking now about our indirect impacts. We're trying not to split them so much as into Scope 3 and I don't know what the term will be when we get there, of Scope 3 for biodiversity. So we're just talking about indirect impacts in general. And we've come up with these top three baddies in our supply chain for carbon and biodiversity. So construction, clearly, for the university, a really big impact. Travel, and that's local commuting, but that is minuscule in comparison to the flights that we're making. And then from a carbon perspective, it's scientific equipment, and for biodiversity, clearly it's food. And there are lots of things that we can do in these areas, but they will be contentious, and we'll need to take people along with us while we make those decisions. So what data could we be using, and is there anything that can't be measured? So, as I said, we've made this commitment to report. Very easy to write, let's report. And then when you start doing it, it's a bit more difficult than you might have expected. So there's lots of guidance out there about how to report on carbon, but generally it's not very helpful for higher education institutions. So we took on a DPhil student who worked in our team for 3 months alongside some academic guidance from Richard Barker, who I think is linked to Teddy Hall, and came up with our own version of how we should do our carbon accounting. We've done a similar thing for biodiversity, hoping that we'd come up with something that was going to be really useful. We have come up with something that's really useful, but it's incredibly time intensive. So that's something that we need to carry on working on. And these are the kinds of data sets that we put in our financial reports. So we show what our direct impacts are. We show what our indirect impacts are, see how enormous they are in comparison to our direct impacts. But there's much less knowledge about how to do anything about those impacts and that carbon emissions. So for now, we're going to be carrying on measuring them as we are and coming up with some policy changes that may reduce them. On non-biodiversity data, I think we're now on method 4, which still doesn't tell a very good story. I don't mean it doesn't paint the university very well. I think it's just not very understandable. I think we're just getting there with carbon, and it's really difficult with biodiversity. And there are tons of things that we can't measure, but we can't use that as an excuse not to do anything. So in conclusion, think about what your material issues are every time you're thinking about environmental sustainability. Identify your scope and write your scope down, but recognise that that's going to change on a very regular basis, and you may have to be extremely agile. And don't use that lack of data as an excuse not to do anything. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we now have time. I haven't got a watch on me, but we've got time for a good half an hour of discussions and questions. And I think actually this time round we're just going to open up to the floor at the beginning. But please can you keep your questions quite short so we've got plenty of time for people to ask them. So who's going to start with the first question? I've got one over here.
This is for the last speaker. Sorry, I have a very bad memory, so I've already forgotten your name. It was really interesting to see the global planetary boundaries chart, and I was really pleased to see donut economics mentioned. But obviously, with donut economics, the planetary boundaries are only one sort of side of things. There are the social requirements, and I was wondering what Oxford is doing to align its environmental goals with its social goals.
That's a great question. Thanks very much. And it's a question I often get asked. And so my job is sustainability, and so it's not ever been in my remit. Not for want of trying. I did social sustainability at Oxford Brookes. There has in the past not been a huge appetite to try and coordinate the work on social sustainability. There is absolutely loads. I'm sure we can all think of an example of good practice and bad practice of social sustainability in the university. I'm happy to say that I think that's really changing, and that's been because of our new Vice-Chancellor. And at her admission speech, she talked about the importance of Oxford on a local, national and global scale. And the way in which she was going to approach that was by appointing somebody that had responsibility for local and global engagement. I talked to her sometime around then and raised, as I always do, what about social responsibility? She said, well, this person's going to be local and global engagement. You could call it social responsibility. So I feel like we do lots of stuff. We don't coordinate it. It's going to start being a bit better coordinated and a bit more visible. And we intentionally had to draw our boundary somewhere so that we moved stuff on the environmental agenda. But without a doubt, we'll be working very closely with the person who's taken on this role.
I'll just take one. I'm going to take the I'm holding the microphone, so I'm going to ask one question actually for all of you, and then I'll hand this back to the audience. You all talked about, and I was very taken by, who's asking the question and therefore what the answer will be. But right now, what I see coming down the line is legislation where you have to report on your environmental impact on nature, on climate. But I mean, we've been doing this for climate for a while, but now nature. So could each of you sort of give me your viewpoint on this sort of legislative framework and how that aligns to the different areas that you work in yourselves? So maybe we could start with Nicola.
Yeah, well, one thing, so the discussion on nature, so I'll talk about finance, which I think is slightly different from corporate that Richard was talking about, although the legislation is similar. So on finance, the climate disclosure requirements are actually about risk. They're not about impact, and that's really important. And that's quite different to what's coming down the line on nature within the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is all about risk and impact. And why is that different? So on climate risk, so financial institutions and large corporates are required to assess and disclose the risk of climate to them. Now, that can include carbon emissions, but it's about risk. It's not about their impact. Now, that's a very limited framing, obviously, for many reasons. Very different than on the nature side. So the nature side, the TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is looking at both. So, and which is what we call double materiality. So it's the impact that nature is having on you and the impact that you are having on nature, and that's a massive step and a really positive step. Now, I think, as I said in my comments, a challenge with nature is it's so much more difficult to estimate than climate. I personally don't think that needs to be an excuse. So actually the French government has just brought in already a requirement to disclose your risk and impact related to nature. And from talking to a few French institutions, I don't speak to French financial institutions every day, but from talking to them, actually I've not heard too much negative about it. I think as long as it's sort of seen that it shouldn't be that you have to get it perfect, but you're looking at how to do it. I think that's the most important thing, to start on that journey of how you would measure both risk and impact. So I do hope that that comes down the line in the UK as well.
So how would that link in then to the sort of the soy farming and your traders?
From a commodity perspective, as I said, everything in commodity trading is about low margin. And therefore, actually, regulation has a very important role to play in maintaining a level playing field.
Yeah.
Ultimately, from the perspective of a commodity trader or a commodity processor, adapting to new regulation, if there's a cost, is okay, as long as all of my competition have to adapt to that cost as well. I think probably the most extreme example of that was in the early 2010s, I think it was 2011, 2012, the Norwegian salmon industry essentially turned on to non-GM soy overnight, which at the time was about $150 a ton premium. Because they all did it at once, it didn't actually have an impact on their business. Now, if you want to say do something like deforestation free, for example, on soy, to put that in perspective, that's about $5 a ton, probably even less actually, more like $3 a ton. So if you can introduce legislation that impacts for $150 a ton and get away with it because everybody's doing it, you can certainly do it if it's around the $3 to $5 a ton mark. So simple answer is, from a commodity trading perspective, regulation has a very important role in terms of keeping a level playing field. From the further downstream in the consumer perspective, then it becomes about what's the link with inflation. And the way the content of the regulation then becomes very important and in terms of what is actually required, what is the extra cost that's being brought into the supply chain. But as I say, ultimately that doesn't really impact the traders themselves, it impacts further downstream. The other part that has to be considered is the implementation of the legislation and regulation, and particularly in Europe, there's a lot of fear at the moment around the commodity markets that legislation will be brought out at EU level, but then it's up to member states to interpret that legislation. And will there be differences in terms of how it's interpreted from one country to another, and what does that mean for businesses that are trying to operate across those borders?
So it won't be a surprise to hear that I'm a big fan of requirement for reporting, but there's no real requirement for universities to report. We won't be caught by TCFD or TNFD. We watch what other universities do. There is awards for universities that report well on sustainability, but it's all very voluntary. And I think a lot of, had Brexit not happened, for example, we would have been caught by European law that would have meant that we would have had to report. So really what we're trying to do is put ourselves in the best position for if we are required to report in the future. But my personal opinion is that the more reporting, the better. In fact, on reporting, I saw a sustainability report by Coldplay today, which was fascinating. They went into lots of detail about the sustainability impact of their tours, and that kind of thing should be normalised so that people are better able to read them and understand what it really means for the product that they're getting involved in.
Thank you. I'm really surprised that you all think regulation and reporting is good, actually. But that's right. We had a question over here. Just bring the mic.
Thank you. My name is Peter Desmond. I'm co-founder of the African Circular Economy Network, and I did geography here at the Hall in 1974. Building on Sophie's question, I was really pleased when Harriet put up the image of the donut economics. It was a question I was going to ask anyway. And what I want to try and do is ask a similar question to Nicola and Jonathan. Nicola, your LinkedIn profile has an image on it. It has two images of the donut economics and one image of the SDGs. And nobody so far has mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to achieve those by 2030, not long away. And Jonathan, you mentioned about happiness, which you said you weren't going to dwell on. So this might be an opportunity as to whether you think donut economics is a way of linking environmental and social indicators. We were talking about measurement here. So if air pollution is one of the environmental boundaries and health is one of the social foundations, surely there should be a link between these two things to know how much air pollution is impacting health and moving towards assisting the achievement of the SDGs. Very complex question. You don't have to answer it in a complex way. The simple question is, what do you think about donut economics as a measurement framework for sustainability?
We'd like to go with that. I preferred the SDGs question, actually. So I think as a framing, I think it's very, very helpful. There are specific things about it that I think need to be tweaked, but it's more from. So I do a lot of work on resilience, and resilience doesn't sort of fit well within that framework. So actually we're doing some work on, well, how would you adapt that framework to resilience, and I know that Kate Ralph is also thinking about that as well. But I think it is a helpful framework, and I think putting together. So you'll see, actually on my LinkedIn, I actually have 3 things. I have the SDGs, I have the donut economics, and then I have the planetary boundaries as well. I have those 3, and I think actually coming up with a new framework incorporates all 3 of those concepts is really important, because I think each one of them kind of misses something by not doing so at the moment.
I think a good example of where donut economics can come in, you mentioned that you work in circular economies in Africa. Africa is ultimately, I believe, going to be where we determine whether we got this right or wrong. For everything that is going on in the rest of the world, the impact of the decisions we're taking now in an African context are going to blow everything else out of proportion. The reason I say that from a commodity perspective is that if you think about what commodities are trying to do, they're providing resources, whether that's food, metal, minerals, whatever, for a population of humans. That population is growing, and therefore the need to source commodities is growing. The main area where that population is growing is sub-Saharan Africa. Equally well, it's also where most of the untapped resources are. 60% of the world's unused potential agricultural land is in sub-Saharan Africa. By that, what I mean is land that is suitable for agriculture but is not currently growing crops. 60% of it is in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can say from a very simple social perspective, well, there's the answer to the problem. How do we feed a growing population? Well, great, the growing population in sub-Saharan Africa, the solution's there as well. We just grow more crops in sub-Saharan Africa. I think once you bring in the environmental perspective, you find there's a lot more value to what's currently in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's the Congo rainforest, the savanna, or whatever, that needs to be protected. And where donut economics can start to come into that, and I agree with Nick, I don't think it's perfect, but it's at least a step in the right direction of trying to balance out those different perspectives, whether it's the environmental drivers and the social drivers. And as I say, I think it's interesting the question came from somebody who's involved in Africa, because it's absolutely crucial there more than anywhere else.
I use questions as a way of introducing myself to the rest of the people in the room, so and hopefully it helps them as well.
Well, hopefully I've done you a good service there as well then.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to just share a quick
Yes, yeah.
on the SDGs point? So I just came back from Paris. We were talking about the new global financing pact, and it is so important. I think a lot of our narratives in high-income countries around sustainability are very focused on carbon, just the carbon issue, for logical reasons. But actually, if we have to take this broader approach, and if we're going to actually address the issues globally. And another great statistic about Africa is that so there's a lot of focus at the moment on African countries trying to use their gas resources and their oil resources and seeing that as a way to increase their prosperity. But actually the value of their natural resources, the Congo rainforest, etc., is so much greater, but we just don't have the markets right now and the economy that allows them to get value from that. So I think that's what we really need to focus on.
And it's to your point of long-term thinking as well.
Yeah.
that it's what's the quick, people often go to what is the quick win today, not what is the potential win for the future.
Question just at the back here.
Thanks very much. Is that on? Thank you. My name's Rob McCare. I'm another former student of this college. So the term greenwashing isn't value neutral. It implies an intent to obfuscate or disguise impacts on the environment and to sell a different story. And I thought there were 3 fantastic presentations, but really interesting counterpoint between the first 2, because between Nicola's and Jonathan's, because Nicola, your presentation was very much looking at the world as an economist, that the incentives on the corporations who are causing these impacts is to make money, and there needs to be compulsion on them to do otherwise. Very interesting to pick up the other side of it, which is the soft aspect of why people do things, why people in corporations do things. So I spent most of my career in the public sector. I just recently moved into the private sector, and I've been really fascinated to see some of the things, Jonathan, you were talking about why people choose to do things that go beyond what there's a regulatory requirement for, beyond what there's a market requirement for, because there isn't a premium, and beyond what investors demand of them. So my question is, what can be done to influence the soft side of things, just to influence, to provide more of a carrot, as well as the very necessary stick of scrutiny, measurement, and regulation to influence behaviours? Thank you.
And if I may, I think it'd be really good if all 3 of you could answer that one. But I'm going to start with Harriet from the university perspective about how do you change behaviour? Because a lot of it, you can have all of these policies, all of these rules, but still you need to influence behaviour. But that's sort of soft side. So Harriet, do you want to start with the university? Then we'll go down the line.
Thank you. It's a really, really difficult question, isn't it, how we change behaviour? I'll just give an example of something that we've done this year. So, and the why we did it is quite interesting, because this year is the first year that we've ever done an energy saving campaign at the university. We did some policy change, which meant that we only heated to a certain temperature, which we've never declared before. We're now only cooling to 26 degrees in university buildings, so don't ask me about Teddy Hall. But then we also asked the community to think about their own personal energy behaviours. And it massively achieved a reduction in consumption of gas around the estate, and we saved about £1 million. But what we had to do before we came up with all the messages that we put into that campaign was work with kind of behavioural change psychologists. And the really key thing that they needed to be sure of with our messaging was that people weren't asked to do futile things. So if we were asking them to do a thing, we were backing it up with activity back of house, and what they were doing was going to have an impact. And I think that's the thing about behaviour change. It's got to seem meaningful and not something that appears a nonsense, which it so obviously does, because they end up being so generic.
I think, first of all, I would maybe question your comment that greenwashing has to be an intent. I've seen various examples where people have set out with no intention of greenwashing but have ended up doing exactly that. It's interesting to hear on the behavioural perspective in terms of making people feel as if seeing the value of it. And I often think of, in terms of driving a car, if you drive a car and you turn the steering wheel, you immediately feel that something's changed. If you drive a boat and you turn the steering wheel, it takes a lot longer to get that feedback loop. And that's one of the reasons it takes a lot longer to learn how to drive a boat than it does to learn how to drive a car. And I think if you're trying to incentivize people, the same thing is true there. They need to be able to see reinforcement on a regular basis of the fact what they're doing is having an impact. Now, before you get to that, of course, you need to understand the individual or the group of individuals. What is it that actually motivates them? And what is it that you can do to, what is that carrot that's really going to be the thing that drives them forward? And often it's actually as much about removing barriers as it is about putting the incentive. In today's world, a lot of people are actually environmentally aware and environmentally conscious and want to do good. They're just too good at finding excuses not to.
So I have two views which may be slightly argue against each other, but I think are consistent. So when Jonathan showed us that lovely picture of the supply chain, which I thought was brilliant, and I was thinking, so I used to be a policy maker as well, and I was thinking actually what we need to do is not just push from one end, but you need to be having policy interventions along the whole chain, and you need, in addition, the consumer being really important and the financier as well. So I think that's point one, that my rational economist said we need to think about sticks and carrots along the whole chain. But I have an example which maybe speaks more to the previous two comments. So when I was a policymaker, so I used to work in climate policy, and all my friends that worked on nature would get so frustrated because climate was always like the big ministerial thing, and they really struggled to get airtime on nature. And then David Attenborough did his, the Planet Earth, the Sea, Under the Water one. And suddenly it changed overnight. And I remember we were right up to a point where we were trying to get something big approved, and it just stopped. And nature suddenly swerved out because the public, suddenly something clicked. The public saw the plastic in the sea and the impact that was having. And within days, huge amounts of money were flowing, policy was being put in place. So actually, those, the knowledge, understanding of the impact that we're having, the people behaviour change is so important, and us economists just didn't predict that at all.
If I could just follow up on that, I think if you look at measurement, it's not measurement and non-measurement. There's actually a few steps in between. That you go from the unknown then to definable, say, and that's what happened with carbon. I personally believe the reason carbon got so much focus so early on was because it was definable. People could say it's a ton of CO2. Then you go to modelling, which is where carbon went to, and then at the end of that you've got measurement. So it's not a measurement or nothing. There are steps in between, and I think that they're important in terms of driving behaviour.
Question just here.
I'm very grateful to the panel for all these excellent frameworks for thinking about these issues. I have a smaller question. I'm Jocelyn Wogan-Brown. I'm a medievalist, currently an associate at the Senior Common Room here. And I'm concerned with the value of nature and with measurements for it. We talk a great deal about carbon emissions. We don't talk much about carbon sequestration, it seems to me. And when you add that to the fact that we talk a great deal about biodiversity net gain, I have two problems here. One is there a feasible way of making the sequestering power of, say, mature ecosystems part of calculations about impact? And secondly, is there a way of preventing biodiversity net gain and offsetting, mitigation hierarchies and so on, from being a kind of equivalent of carbon offsetting and degenerating into a license to destroy ecosystems?
I'm going to ask Harriet to deal with that one. It's a very good question. I have an opinion, but I'm not giving it.
Let me start with the first bit, I believe that there are ways of measuring sequestration, and the carbon data that I showed had some sequestration data in there for the land that we own. I think, as with all of our nature data, it will mature, and it's a starting point at the moment. So, and it should be kind of more regularly done. And I think we're probably quite unusual as a university of being able to report on it. There was a move for the whole sector to work better on it as well, so I expect that to come soon. As to whether or not, as to what we can do to stop biodiversity net gain leading to an excuse to do things that absolutely shouldn't be done, well, I don't know anywhere near as much as Kathy knows about the metric that's linked to biodiversity net gain. I know that the metric puts a huge amount of value on, well, in fact, I'm told that it comes up with a kind of you cannot do this if it's something like ancient woodland. So you can't do anything. The metric will just tell you can't get rid of ancient woodland. There's nothing that you can do to ameliorate for that. But we need to think of more than that. So I think I'm in rooms where people know a lot more about the detail of this than I do, but I understand the issue.
There's a question down here.
It's a very easy question. Yeah. Which is...
It's never easy.
Which is the idea that, the whole idea of like greenwashing, and do companies use it as a deadline to incentivize themselves and their workers to try and achieve sustainability by a set time? Or is it a greenwashing strategy to kind of increase consumer trust in the companies? They say, oh, they're going to become more sustainable in the next 10 years. I'd rather choose their products than their competitors. And you said that usually it's not always intended, but I feel that is there a kind of grey area that companies can use?
Yeah, yes, there is a grey area. And I think, again, a lot, it all comes back to incentives. So what are we, as a global community, incentivizing companies to do? And if we give them the incentives of providing us with data that looks very nice but doesn't have much behind it, then that's exactly what they're going to do. If we, on the other hand, ask for either more rigorous information, or, to the carrot point, give them the incentive to actually make change on the ground and do, or in some cases, preserve what is already there on the ground, then that can have a much greater impact than just the reporting of data.
Nicola, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think there are many dimensions to greenwashing. I think, and it can be intentional. You know, it could be that you want to have a product that's more competitive than your competitor, but I think it can be unintentional quite often, and so it can. There are real data constraints that make it really difficult to measure sustainability. There's also what you define as sustainability. So originally we were just focusing on carbon, so we said, oh, this product is sustainable because it's low carbon, but then our definition of sustainability broadens, and you realise that actually it is greenwashing in other ways. Another way we talk about greenwashing is things like green bonds. So people are very critical of green bonds because a green bond could finance a big, I won't name a fossil fuel company, finance a big fossil fuel company to build a renewable plant, but actually the rest of the company is still extracting oil. So is that greenwashing? I would say actually it is, even though it's a green bond. So there are lots of different dimensions, and as I was saying before we started today, actually financial institutions and corporates are not the only people that greenwash. Government greenwashes a lot as well.
Okay, David, we'll just get the microphone.
I wanted to come back to this really interesting question about incentives and regulation, and this perhaps is particularly addressed at Jonathan, but others may be interested as well. And that is this very interesting question about, the need, the regulation being necessary so that people feel there's a level playing field, and then the problems of implementation of those regulations. And so I suppose the question is, I'd like to ask about how far you feel that the state infrastructures or international global infrastructures are in place to make sure that those sorts of regulations, which seem so crucial to the incentives of these traders you're talking about, how do we have enough state capacity or globally or international capacity in order for these huge supply chains in order to enforce those regulations? And do you feel that getting better? Do you feel that's being addressed by the international community, by the environmental community?
I think it depends on what it is you really want to achieve, which sort of I'm harking on about that, but it really does. And when it comes to regulation needs measurement and it needs some form of traceability. Typically within commodity supply chains, there are three sort of broad buckets that traceability comes into. One is what's known as book and claim, which is effectively a carbon credit. So you say, I've bought these goods, I'm going to buy a certificate that says some goods somewhere in the world that are equivalent to mine were produced in a sustainable way, and I can put them together and everything's fine. The other extreme is full traceability. which means that you can track those goods at every step through the supply chain, and you can say, I know exactly which farm or which mine those goods came from, and therefore I can link my goods to the practices that were employed in producing them. The middle ground is a thing called mass balance, which is basically where, if you imagine a silo, what goes into the silo, the amount of sustainable that went into the silo is the amount that can come out the other side. It doesn't have to be exactly the same bit, but it has to go through the same single point. The industry sees that as the solution, the mass balance. Why? Because the infrastructure, to your point, is there now to do it. I think book and claim is largely discredited already, so we can probably put that to one side. Commodity industries are focusing on mass balance. They see that as the solution. Governments see full traceability as the solution. And the simple answer to your question is no, there is not the infrastructure there for full traceability today.
We've got one question at the front, and then we're going to lead then on to Dimitri, and then I think there's so many questions. We are all getting very hot, and there's glasses of Prosecco at the back, so I think we'll keep those going, and we can ask those questions over a drink. But let's take a question from the front.
I'll keep it short. Thanks all for the presentation. Nicola, I was really intrigued by the last point you mentioned. You know, you gave the example of possibly a fossil fuel company, you know, raising green bonds and then, you know, using it to build renewables, etc. And you'll probably classify that as greenwashing. I wonder what Jonathan would think about that in the context of incentives. I mean, assume that this company is, you know, sitting somewhere in India or Africa, etc., right, where coal is the baseload power, it's powering millions and millions of homes in rural India or Africa, right? So, but you have to create incentives for heavy emitters to, you know, kind of take that path of sort of renewables. So I was wondering, you know, what your perspective is there, given, you know, the very interesting perspective of incentives and what works.
Yeah, and let me clarify that I'm not saying that the green bond is greenwashing, but I think if that fossil fuel company was then claiming to the world, I'm green, invest in me, and look at this great stuff that I'm doing on green bonds, but not talking about the fact that they're still, you know, investing a lot in new oil extraction, for example, then I think that there's questions that need to be raised about that, but not the green bond specifically. And I think so. I think that there are 2 points I make. So one is that thinking about the fossil fuel company itself, and then the really important point you made about developing countries. So the fossil fuel company, I think the key thing there is the transition plans. So I think this is a really important tool. I must admit, it's one of those ones that a year ago when it first came up, and 2 years ago, at COP26, our government in the UK committed to make transition plans mandatory. And I thought, oh, you know, another requirement on financial institutions. But it's a really important tool because it then allows you to say, you know, how this is my net zero target for 2050, as most of them have. How am I actually going to get there? And in the short term, maybe that might still be, you know, financing a gas power plant in Nigeria or something, because that's consistent with the global transition. So if you can say that, you know, that's my plan, and this is the evidence for why that's the right plan to net zero, I think that's, you know, you disclose that. That's fine. I think if you're saying for the UK, I'm going to invest in coal, when actually it's extremely clear that for the UK, that would not be on the UK's net zero plan, then I think that's another issue. And coming to the emerging and developing economies, I think that's a real, you know, it's a really difficult one because many of them, you know, they do have massive energy access issues. And so, you know, for many of them, investing in gas might be a very important near-term solution, and that's the line. I guess my worry is around stranded assets. So, you know, if in 10 years' time, actually, they're finding that becomes a stranded asset because a lot of them will be publicly owned in those countries, then that's potentially a big public debt issue on countries. So I think there's lots of interesting issues there.
On that happy note, I would like to ask a question, a teaser question that will lead us from the green bonds to the liquid assets in the back of the room. Since we're talking about measurement, it reminds me why Hitchcock is such a great director, because he brought us too many suspects in his movies, and then you had to wait 2 hours to find a single guilty person. Likewise, when we create metrics to evade greenwashing, to stop greenwashing, and so on and so forth, too many metrics, particularly when they are suggested for regulatory purposes, as David argued before, and you go to politicians, too many metrics, they get confused, things get opaque, and then you don't achieve much. So how many metrics are too many, and how many metrics are too few? And on that note, I thank everybody who helped us to make this a reality, the development team, the IT team, everybody, the caterers, and above all, our 3 distinguished speakers and the audience who made this discussion a very lively and thought-provoking discussion.